Absolute pleasure to welcome Jamie Byng from Canongate here to Banter at St. Augustine's tonight. Jamie, you started off in a very interesting way. I'm not talking about Canongate, I'm talking about Chocolate City. Let's start with an easy question. What's your favourite funk, soul and rare groove tracks from the old days?
Oh God, there are so many I could select. I always loved this trumpeter called Blue Mitchell, who was a kind of classic jazz trumpeter in the kind of Blue Note vein, but he put a couple of records out in the early 70s, and there's a cover he did of a Samande track called The Message, which I always loved DJing, just very, very hard funk, but James Brown was the kind of staple of a lot of what we played, James Brown and the JBs and Lynn Collins and Marva Whitney and all these great so-called female preachers that he had, and it'd be everything from Herbie Hancock to the Soul Searchers to Fela Kuti and we used to play a lot of the original breaks, which then people sampled. So it was always nice mixing things up like that. So yeah, always surprising people. That was, but always playing beautiful dance music, things for people to dance to.
Mm. As someone who did clubs as well, I mean, years ago, I really enjoyed DJing, but I also enjoyed the ins and night when you saw how much money you made as well. Like, I mean, was Chocolate City a success financially as well?
Yeah, it was. It was kind of, I suppose it really kind of taught me the beginnings of what a P&L was, because I think our break even with the club was 210 people, and that's what we needed to get in to cover our costs. But the venue could take 500, and because it was on 2 floors in this great venue that's no longer a music venue in Edinburgh called The Venue. And, you know, my then girlfriend, who was the then wife and mother of my first 2 kids, she and I we were in our early 20s. On a good night, we would, having had the most incredible evening, we'd come back home, we would have made £1,000 undeclared. And it was like, whoa, this, as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old, most of that went straight into vinyl, which was just like, so over the years I've built a pretty big record collection and still buy vinyl kind of fairly voraciously. I had the, there's a website, I'm suddenly blanking on its name.
Discogs?
Discogs, God, I discovered Discogs about 18 months ago, which was not a good thing. On one level, it was a brilliant thing on another level, but I used to love spending time in secondhand record shops, just going through the stacks, because you never quite know what's going to be in there. And there used to be a lot of great secondhand record shops in Edinburgh, so that's where I really kind of learn a lot about music, but also creating a scene is a very interesting thing to be part of and to create the whole atmosphere. And Whitney, my then girlfriend, she is a wonderful artist, and she used to do all the banners in the club, and we used to force everyone, well, not force, but you were encouraged, even before you'd paid to get in the club, to have a shot of tequila or mezcal on the door. And I love anything that connects people, and music is obviously an amazing thing for connecting people, but I loved the idea that everyone would have a shot of something before they came in. It kind of created a nice kind of ritual, like taking a communion of sorts.
Okay, like given like, I mean, your fondness for music, and like obviously, you know, you knew you could make money from it. Were you ever tempted to do music rather than books?
Yeah, it was definitely. Although I've got to say, the making money was a kind of welcome byproduct of the club. We didn't start the club because we think, oh, we want to make money. We wanted to make a great club, and to be honest, I wanted to play the sort of music that I wasn't really hearing in clubs, because I wanted to dance to that music out of a great sound system. So that was actually the kind of impulse. And I was studying English literature at the time at Edinburgh University, and when I left university, we carried on running the club, and I didn't go down to London, even though I'm originally from the south of England. And even if you're not from there, there's quite a strong gravitational pull, or there can be, unless you resist it, to go down to London, just because in many ways that's where more opportunities are than anywhere else in Britain. But actually, there were different kinds of opportunities, and also almost more interesting opportunities for me staying in Edinburgh. So I carried on running the club, didn't really know what I was going to do, and then by one of those kind of lovely serendipitous things which sometimes happens in your life, a friend called me, and I was grumbling slightly about the fact that I was doing this postgraduate thing at Edinburgh University, which I was kind of into, but actually it wasn't really where I wanted, where I'd pour my kind of time and kind of energy. And she'd worked at this publishing house called Canongate the year before doing voluntary work, and she said, you should look up this woman, Stephanie Wolfe Murray, who founded Canongate in '73. And I did that. I wrote to her. She said, why don't you come and see me? And that was back in November of '92. And I've never worked anywhere else. It was interesting hearing Steve talk about cycles. I don't think in cycles at all. I certainly don't think in 5-year cycles. I just kind of, I don't really think in that kind of a way. I just think about trying to continue doing the things that I think matter. And I've been lucky enough in a way to work at the same place now for 22 years, and I've been running it for 20 years. So that's made it, that's created different kinds of opportunities for me, being able to, with the colleagues I have, to kind of make the decisions about not only what we publish, but how we publish, and the way we think about sharing ideas, which I suppose is, to put it in its most basic sense, what I think publishing is, particularly in this current climate where the opportunities have kind of proliferated in interesting ways.
I mean, obviously, you know, just as the kind of amount of platforms and the amount of ways to get books out have grown and grown and grown, the number of publishers has grown and grown and grown. So obviously, for Canongate to offer kind of like something unique, I mean, you talked in an interview before about enthusiasm and energy are vital, and none of it is so subjective. The passion is crucial. That's the single most important thing. That was kind of a quote from an interview about 10 years ago. Would you still agree that, like, I mean, they're the kind of like the keynotes?
Completely, because it is so subjective. So the only thing you can, to me, you don't know what people are going to want to read. And I've always thought there are lots of interesting analogies between running a club and running a publishing house and being a DJ and a publisher. And a lot of it is about trusting your taste in terms of what you think is valuable and original and got something exciting or joyous or disturbing or whatever it is, but something that's going to affect someone else in a way that's kind of meaningful. And yeah, that's still the kind of guiding principle for me in terms of where I end up spending my energy, is to do it in things that I think are going to kind of nourish me in ways. And I hope that they're nourishing me, by extension they might nourish other people, but you don't know. And I certainly think kind of publishing for the market is just, to me, it's just the kiss of death, or it's certainly not what we do. And I think it's certainly more pleasurable to be working with the people and on the books that you really love. And so that guiding principle of kind of energy and enthusiasm, you can only truly have that for the things you love. And if you don't have that, I don't think you should be putting your energy there. That's for me just a kind of, it's almost a kind of, it's obvious, but it's the way that we've run Canongate, and I've run Canongate.
One of the people you started working with early on, Jamie, and like, I mean, you kind of worked with him a long time, right up to his kind of unfortunate demise with Gil Scott-Heron. You know, I mean, he would be a kind of like case in point, just as you're kind of talking there about the kind of ethos behind Canongate and the ethos behind you as a publisher. Like, I mean, of old, publishers have always been these people who take authors and work with them, trust them, develop them, give them money when they need it, look after them. And just kind of, was that the kind of connection you had with kind of Gil as well? That this is someone that you thought was a very, very special talent, and you wanted to nurture and develop him, and like and make sure he was comfortable?
Well, I'd say it was more that Gil nurtured and developed me more than I nurtured and developed him. Kind of, I try to help him communicate his ideas in a different sort of way than the music he was putting out. Although we did events together where sometimes connected with the books we were publishing, but he was one of the greatest performers I've ever come across or worked with, and he was a total inspiration for me. And I met him when I was quite young, age 20, when I think it was when even before I'd started Chocolate City, I saw him play at a venue in Edinburgh called the Queen's Hall, and I came out of actually not out of the performance because I stayed in the building, but he went off stage, and I was just like, I've just witnessed one of the most extraordinary live performances I've seen. And I had an old record with me, in fact a bootleg that had come out of Jamaica in 1980 from a reggae sunsplash in Kingston, and it had a track, it had Gil doing a live version of Shut 'Em Down, this song he wrote about nuclear power stations. And I managed to talk my way backstage and showed Gil this record. He was like, what the fuck's that record, man? I've never seen this in my life before. And it was a brilliant kind of icebreaker. Yeah. And by the end of the conversation, we just had we just kind of hit it off he said, "Oh, I'm playing at the Jazz Cafe in London next week. Why don't you come down? I'll put you on the guest list." And after that, I went backstage. He said, "Come backstage," and that was the beginning. And then, you know, I ended up reissuing these novels he wrote, and then we published this memoir posthumously a couple of years ago, just about 9 months after he died. But as I say, he kind of nurtured and inspired me more than I would say I nurtured. I certainly didn't nurture him. Kind of by the time I met Gil, he was the finished article as far as I was concerned in terms of his, and he was a very powerful creative force.
Yeah. When you look back right now at, say, 20 years of Canongate, you know, obviously there's certain books you've published that kind of stand out for various reasons, like Jan Martel's kind of Life of Pi because it's the Booker Prize and that. When you look back yourself, what books do you kind of highlight? What books do you pick out that you've published that you're very proud of? Obviously, you're going to say you're proud of everything, but there's certain books, I'm sure, that are in the list that you kind of go, okay, that made me. That was a good one.
Kind of, there are a lot, so it's always a bit divisive to start picking out individual ones, and I could bore you all by just telling you about 30 books back to back, but I'm not going to do that. Kind of in a way, things will just pop out into my head when you ask that question. One that comes immediately to mind, because you're talking about Life of Pi, is that I published a novel by an American writer from Texas called Ben Fountain, a novel called Billy Lynn's Long Half-Time Walk, which we published about 2 years ago. Fantastic. Really remarkable novel, won a National Book Critics Circle Award. And I just found out last night, I kind of knew it was happening, but it became official last night that Ang Lee, who made Life of Pi, his next feature film is going to be Billy Lynn's Long Half-Time Walk. So that kind of comes to mind. I think that's an extraordinary book and one of the great kind of anti-war novels I've ever read, kind of really in its own way up there with anything that's been written about war, but also very, very funny and just a really heartbreaking book too. Kind of, there's a writer I've been working with since 1998 called Michel Faber, who I don't know if anyone in this room has come across, but I first published a collection of stories by him in '98 called Some Rain Must Fall, and then we published a novel called Under the Skin, which was turned into a film quite recently with Jonathan Glazer directing, with Scarlett Johansson in the lead. We then published a book called The Crimson Petal and the White, which is another great novel set in Victorian London about a prostitute called Sugar, and it's an 850-page novel that reviewers said it's the novel that Dickens might have written had he been able to, in terms of the subject matter. It's very, very kind of, not graphic, but it certainly shows a side to London that perhaps Dickens wasn't, particularly in terms of the sexual aspects to it. It's also it's a feminist novel in many ways, The Crimson Petal and White, even though Michel's actually a guy, but he described himself as being, certainly in the 80s, growing in Melbourne as he was then, thought of himself as a feminist. But his new novel, which I'm publishing in 5 weeks' time, is called The Book of Strange New Things, and I think it's as really up there with any fiction that we've ever published. But, you know, as I say, we've been publishing Michel now for, it'll be 16 years. It was 17 years ago I first met him. So that's a long relationship, and it's a very close one, and we handle all his rights internationally, and he doesn't have an agent, and he and his wife Eva, who sadly just died 2 months ago, we are very close friends, and so he's very important, but he's also a remarkable writer. I've just been very lucky to work with a lot of good people. I did this myth series where we ended up commissioned Philip Pullman to write this book called The Good Man, Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ. I say I commissioned. The series was a series where we asked writers, or I asked writers who I thought were brilliant, to retell a myth in whatever way they chose. And we started it with Margaret Atwood and Jeanette Winterson and a woman called Karen Armstrong, who wrote a book called A Short History of Myth. So it wasn't a specific retelling in the way that Margaret Atwood tackled the myth of Odysseus and Penelope, but they all kind of did different things. David Grossman ended up doing this extraordinary book on the figure of Samson as kind of portrayed in Judges. And Philip Pullman did this great retelling of the story of Jesus, which is really brilliant. And to work with someone like Margaret Atwood or Philip Pullman or Jeanette Winterson or Ali Smith, these were all people who contributed to that series. And, you know, when I was flying in here today, I was just reading what is close to the final edit of this new book we're publishing with Nick Cave. And, you know, Nick Cave to me is another of these just extraordinary creative forces right now who's not only a brilliant songwriter, not only a beautiful pianist, not only a wonderful performer, he's a great screenwriter. He's also a very, very talented writer on the page. So we published a novel called The Death of Bunny Munro 5 years ago, and this book we're working on right now is something we're going to be publishing next year, and we haven't even told anyone we're going to be publishing it next year, so you've kind of heard this for the first time. But I was just doing a kind of going through as I say, what's close to the final edit on the plane today, and it's an extraordinary book, and working with Nick is another real privilege.
Yeah, like as you're kind of talking there about all those books, you know, there's other books you kind of published at Canongate. I hadn't realised Canongate had published. I hadn't realised, for example, that you'd done the David Byrne book, How Music Works. I hadn't realised, you know, that Barack Obama's The Audacity of Hope will come out in Canongate.
And Dreams from My Father, which is an even better book actually. That's the Obama book to read.
It's a huge list, you know, and like, you know, keeping, like, and you've just signed 2 great Irish authors, Kevin Barry and Mary Costello, you know. Yeah. So I mean, the talent acquisition is still going on. At what point does it come? Do you kind of go to yourself, okay, enough, we need to kind of stop here in some kind of ways, because you started out as a small Scottish independent publishing house. You're now a big player. I mean, like, Jamie, you are a big player.
But it depends how you define big, and I think we publish some brilliant writers who in their own different ways are massive in terms of what they do on the page, and some of them have ended up being pretty successful writers. Kind of Jan Martel's Life of Pi is, however you cut it, that's been a massively successful novel. We've sold 4 million copies of it. You know, that's a lot of copies. But we're not a big publishing house in relation to the kind of the publishing the publishing kind of industry. And although, as you said, there are more publishers, actually there aren't. There are lots of kind of, there's been a very consistent process of conglomerization of the industry. So in fact, you know, over the last 30 years, you've seen pretty much every great independent house is now owned by one of 4 conglomerates. And now Penguin and Random coming together, you've got within that Jonathan Cape, Hamish Hamilton, Secker and Warburg, The Bodley Head, Harville Press. You know, you could go on, and within Hachette, you've got Little Brown and you've got Virago, and you just, so actually, there are kind of 4 giants in this country, in the UK, and then there's a bunch of publishers that turnover-wise are tiny compared to them, and we, along with Faber and Profile and Atlantic, and you know, there are a few independent publishing houses, but there aren't that many actually. In terms of what we're doing, kind of, I think we're as ambitious as we've ever been in terms of believing we can publish books really skillfully and beautifully, because we love making physical books that you actually want to hold and give and own, and that I think add to the experience of what a writer is doing to you when they transport you. And I think the publisher's role is in part to enhance that experience by the object. It's not that I'm in any way kind of anti-digital, because in many respects I love the fact that I'm publishing in 2014, because the opportunities are greater than they've ever been. It's an amazing time to be a publisher, I think. I'm not saying it's all straightforward, but I think it is an amazing time in terms of what you can do creatively. I don't think there's ever been a better time to be a reader. More books are available now to people than at any point in the history of humanity, partly because more books are being written, but because more books are available, whether it's digitally or, you know, the fact that you can find a second-hand book that's not going to be in the places where you might have bought it 10 years ago. You can find it online through Abe or through the kind of secondary marketplaces in Amazon. You can pretty much find any book that's being written, kind of maybe not a rare manuscript from the 17th century, but you know, pretty much any book published in the 20th century, without that much difficulty, you can get your hands on it. And in a lot of instances, you can download it within a minute, or you can have it delivered to your house, you know, within a day. Now, I actually love bookshops and love going into bookshops, and so I don't buy any books online actually, and I very rarely download books just because I'd rather read a physical book. But as a publishing house, we really celebrate digital, and not just as a way of people reading, but perhaps more significantly how you reach audiences and make them aware of things.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier on, though, Jim, you were talking about, like, you know, the fact that you are kind of independent. There's 4 big ones right now. There's 4 big houses. There's also kind of like a new player on the block, and that's Amazon. And like, you know, there's a guy who's appeared at Banter in the past called Unpersonal, who's now their UK publisher. You know, and like in terms of Amazon being kind of like a player now, in terms of kind of like signing up authors and publishing books, how do you what's your read on that? Do you kind of like welcome them? Do you think they're not going to go anywhere? Do you think they're on like high to nothing? Or do you think authors are going to go to them? Or are authors going to like kind of go that, well, okay, if Amazon are paying money, we'll go there? Or will the fact that someone like Canongate is kind of offering that kind of enthusiasm, that energy, and that kind of zeal, is that still going to be attractive?
Well, Amazon is a kind of very significant new force, not just in publishing, but in other areas too. As a force for actually publishing books, they're frankly irrelevant. They've not published any book of any significance so far, despite desperately trying to. As a retailer, they are hands down the biggest player in the global market. And it might be different if you're looking at China, because that's in of itself massive. But in terms of English language publishing, and now across retailing across the whole of Europe and into more and more countries, they are very, very significant. But I think there's no real culture of publishing within there. Basically they're a fulfillment house. And so that's, you know, they're a very, very effective one, and one that we work closely with, and they are very important for our business. But I certainly don't feel threatened by the idea that Amazon are offering something to authors, or the sort of authors that we might want to publish, that is anyway a problem for us. And, you know, at the end of the day, I kind of celebrate competition, and I celebrate the fact there's diversity in our industry, because as long as you are clear on what you're trying to do and have some sense of what you're doing and some ability to kind of make it work so you can keep on publishing. I have friends in so many different publishing houses, both in the UK and around the world, and I don't see them as competitors. I see them as kind of, in certain respects, kind of, you know, collaborators, and certainly colleagues, even if they're not in different publishing houses. And occasionally we'll lose a book to Jonathan Cape, or to Penguin, or to Bloomsbury, or to Secker, or whatever. The first thing I always do is drop a note saying, God, congratulations getting that book. That's an amazing book. As an industry, compared to some other industries, I think it's a very generous one. I think people all know that we're doing something that is challenging, you know, and it's not easy publishing books. Doesn't make it any less exhilarating or exciting, and I think it's a total privilege to be a publisher. It's so kind of just not every day, but I regularly think I'm very, very fortunate to have found myself to be in the position I am, doing something I love as much as I do. It's just it's a real joy to be for me, being a publisher. And so the Amazon thing, I could talk a lot about Amazon, and there's only so much I want to talk about it here, but you know, they're unquestionably a very, very significant and relatively new presence within the industry, and they've done certain things that I think are very positive, and they've done certain things that I think are very negative. So I've got kind of mixed feelings about them, but certainly not worried about them as a threat to the publishing that we do, or that authors would rather be published by Amazon than us or another publisher.
Yeah, another quote, Jamie, from you recently as well about the way Canongate's business is going was you talked about like publishing fewer books and better books, you know, and we talked earlier on about the way that kind of, I suppose, mirrored Richard Russell at Excel and his approach to kind of records, that like he only works with a handful of acts, he may only release a couple of records a year, you know. Do you kind of think, you know, is it like it's a really good idea, it's like just to kind of like hone down and concentrate on the books, but is it actually hard to do in practice?
It's hard to do in practice, and to discipline yourself to be highly, highly selective, because it's very easy to buy a book. It's much, much harder to publish it well. And everything you commit to, and it's true in life generally, everything you commit yourself to, in some respects, will prevent you from spending as much time on the other things you're committed to. And so I suppose that very basic truth is something that I'm very aware of. So if you take on too many books, you're not going to be able to publish them with as much care and time and thought. Kind of, if you break it down in a very simple sense, if you're publishing 40 books a year, if you're suddenly publishing 60 books a year, you can only give half as much, a third as much time to those across the whole list. If you cut your list down to 20, you're going to be able to spend twice as much time every step of the way, from the point of acquisition, from the editorial process, from the design, through the presenting of that book, from the marketing, from the publicity. And from a financial point of view, as long as you're making a smart selection of the things you're committed to, if you're making them bigger books, and we're not just publishing books for commercial reasons, but if you're committed to publishing a book, you want to take it to as wide an audience as you can do it without compromising what you are or what the book is. And I think, but you've got to get the balance right. We publish about 40 originals a year, and that for a company our size seems about the right number. At times I look back and think, God, with hindsight, we took on too many things that year, and there were a few things that suffered as a result. Or actually, with hindsight, that just wasn't quite good enough, that book, in terms of, it would have been better if we'd spent more time on the things that we cared about even more. But I think it's really important to be very, very focused in what you're doing and make sure that you're really doing justice to everything you commit to, because that's the kind of contract when you sign with an author. You are going to do everything you can to publish that book as well as you can. And that's why I'm very wary of overcommitting ourselves or even growing Canongate that much bigger, because I think in terms of I'd rather grow it in other ways, which we are, which to me is a more interesting way for us to evolve as a business, and we don't think of ourselves as a publishing house in a way.
I mean, I've left kind of like, I suppose the one question till last, and you kind of were talking there about the fact that, like, if you decide to do 40 books, you can kind of give them your all the attention, but sometimes the best laid plans, because I'm sure that you didn't expect to spend as much time talking about the Julian Assange book and emailing back and forth about that. I mean, with hindsight, do you kind of wish you'd never heard of Julian Assange, or were you quite happy the whole experience went?
No, I don't. Kind of, on one level, I have regrets because I spent more of my life than, with hindsight, I wish I had done trying to work with Julian, who's not the easiest person to work with. But it was also something I learnt a huge amount from, and he was someone who particularly at the point when we acquired his memoir, he was in a very, very interesting position. And I think the more I got to know him, and I worked with a guy called Andrew Hagan, who's a brilliant writer, wonderful Scottish writer, great writer of fiction and non-fiction. And bringing Andy into the project to me was a really, I think we did everything that we could have done to have made that book a success. We sold it to 38 publishers around the world. We had Sonny Meadow at Knopf as the US partner. Kind of everything was there. And Julian, in an act of kind of self-destruction, just kind of blew the thing up, which was a shame, because actually I think he had some incredibly important things to convey, and actually the memoir that Andy was assisting him in writing really helped you understand him psychologically. But the more I understood him psychologically, the more I realized it was inevitable that he was going to end up behaving. That anything is inevitable, but it made me realize why perhaps things played out the way they did. But I really don't regret it, because I think, first of all, I think regret is totally pointless. I think all you can do is learn from things, and you've got to retain a sense of humor. I look back on it with some amusement. I don't like the fact that it ended up costing us a lot of money, because we might have done more creative things with that money, and also the time I spent on it. But the positive that came out from it was we all, not just me, but my colleagues at Canongate, learned a lot from that, and it's stuff that's informing other things we're doing moving forward. And yeah.
Okay. Like, I said that was the final question, but there's one kind of, I suppose, other last question, and you kind of you touched on there. You were talking about, like, more exciting ways of actually working at Canongate. You've done Canongate TV as well. I mean, are there other ideas coming down the tracks that will be kind of spreading the word about Canongate that you're excited about at the moment?
To be honest, there are a lot. So I've limited time now to tell you about some. And kind of one thing and it kind of goes back in a way to where we started with the running of a club and creating one-offs and nights and experiences, because reading is a very solitary experience, and it's things like this and book festivals and things like that where people come together who have a shared interest in an author or a book. But we published a beautiful book last October called Letters of Note. I don't know if any of you have seen this book. It's a wonderful anthology or compilation put together by this guy from Manchester called Sean Usher, and the subtitle of the book is Correspondence Deserving of a Wider Audience. And it sprang out of a website he started in 2009, which has become a hugely successful website in that a lot of people go to it. And he's got an incredible eye for curation and for letters. So we published this book in partnership with a very interesting new kid on the block on the publishing scene called Unbound, which is a kind of crowd-funded model, which I think is very interesting. But one of the things I talked to Sean about, and with my colleagues when we did it, it was kind of span out of something we'd done with Colin Firth when we published a book called The People Speak, The Voices That Changed Britain. And we did this amazing event with Colin Firth and Ian McKellen and Emily Blunt, and it was kind of some really interesting people reading speeches. And I said we should do these with the letters, so we started creating these events called Letters Live. And the lineup of the first one we did at the Tabernacle in West London last December was Gillian Anderson, Benedict Cumberbatch, Nick Cave, Juliet Stevenson, Bruce Robinson, Peter Serafinovich, Neil Gaiman, all reading letters to an audience. Kind of the event sold out in about 45 minutes, so it was a kind of venue of 320. We could have sold 3,000 tickets for that. But we've since done 6 more of these. I was in Dublin last weekend at the Dun Laoghaire Festival, and we had an incredible lineup of people there, from Kevin Barry to Joseph O'Connor to Kathy Belton to Charlie Murphy to Owen Rowe, all reading letters there. And we've now had, over the course of these 7 events, we've had Russell Brand, we've had Stephen Fry, we've had Caitlin Moran, we've had Clark Peters from The Wire, all these people reading letters to a live audience. The 2 events we did at Hay, 1,700 people, and they were the fastest selling events they've ever had at Hay, apart from a Seamus Heaney reading 5 years ago. So that's something we're developing. Actually, we're setting up, can't go into the details of who's involved, but something really, really interesting with a very, very high profile actor who's been at 3 of the events and has performed at 3 of the events. And that's quite exciting for me, that whole thing of taking words and taking ideas and sharing them with an audience and doing it in that live setting. So I think the event side of what we do is going to be scaled up. We're doing more and more involvement in productions. In fact, doing something that's very interesting with David Byrne, developing how music works into something with a great production company. And so we're, as I said, I don't really think of ourselves as a publishing house in a conventional sense. Kind of, we care passionately about writers and writing, but I often think they are springboards into doing all sorts of other things, which is about ideas and affecting audiences. So that's where my head's at right now, as much as anything.
Cool. Jamie Byng, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was great. That was really, really good.